So did they mislearn the Democrats 2020 and think that personal attacks on Donald Trump and what he'd done was the way, when actually they'd had a bad economic time then as well? Obviously, COVID a big factor, but did they take the wrong lessons out of a victory at that stage?
I think there's a couple of things at play here. Certainly, if you look at democratic governments around the world, incumbency is not a great place to be at the moment. And I think this is probably the biggest issue for the Albanese government to take out of this, is focus on the economy, focus on cost of living, because publics are saying that their governments weren't reactive enough to the cost of living pressures coming out of COVID. I think the other issue here was that I think Joe Biden has to accept a fair degree of responsibility for the outcome of this result. If he had chosen not to run, the Democrats would have had a primary where they could have elected a candidate from within the party that would have had a much broader consensus, that would have had time to identify themselves. And if it wasn't Kamala Harris, that would have been a candidate then who could have distanced themselves from the Biden and Harris administration and crafted a new economic message and vision that responded to the underwhelming feel in the electorate about change. And I took one key thing out of the Democratic National Convention when it happened. They released the DNC policy statement, and they hadn't even bothered in that document to do a find and replace for Biden with Harris. So the policy settings were fundamentally exactly the same. And of course,
Kamala Harris was asked, what would you do differently?
Absolutely. And she dropped the ball on that question. She basically paused and said, nothing springs to mind.
She should have had months. She should have known it was a possibility, is what...
So they had
caught the car element there almost.
Just to add to what you're saying, because I think what you're saying is 100% right, but if you add to that, the scenario, and we might see this in 4 years' time, but say a Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, super popular, you'd think he would have been a very good prospect of holding that blue wall, or a better prospect than Kamala Harris was.
Well, and certainly in Pennsylvania, where he's a very popular governor and he's run consistent races, and despite the changing nature of that electorate, he's maintained that sort of centrist core in his policies. I think Kamala Harris ran a good campaign. Like, she had a very small amount of time. I think it was absolutely phenomenal how quickly the Democratic Party and institutions coalesced around her when that decision was made. And I think if Biden had have run, if you look at the polls, and even on election day, the favourability ratings for Biden are really, really low. So I couldn't see him doing this time around any better than Harris did. But she didn't have enough time to really present herself to the country. She doesn't have a sort of a stronger record. I mean, Biden was a known quality for 50 years in US political life. She didn't have that track record behind her. And I think they just didn't get an economic message across. And they weren't crafting out and separating themselves from the last 4 years of what they were going to do different. And Trump was talking in Trump ways, in Trump manners. And he was underneath hitting some core issues. And the Republican Party machine was very focused. While the president-elect is the president-elect, and they allowed him to do whatever he wanted to do, the system underneath and the messages underneath, particularly in the swing states, was really core. It's about the economy, it's about jobs, it's about inflation, it's about the cost of living, and it's about doing something different. And I really think the American public went for decisiveness over coherence and cohesion. They wanted a decisive response to some of the issues that are plaguing their everyday life in American society, and they're willing to accept the chaos that comes with the Trump administration around that for what they hopefully see as decisive, particularly economic action.
Can I ask you, you're saying that Trump did so successfully, and are you doing better than you were 4 years ago? But what about this expectation management? You hear a lot of the Americans that speak about everything's now going to change, that Donald Trump's back in. Does he have to be a little cautious about your whole life is going to be 100% better because when I'm there on January 21, it's all going to be fine again?
Absolutely. And I think, I watched his speech that he gave last night. It was 1:30 in the morning over there, where he said he'd won the nomination. It was toned down compared to the types of speeches he has in rally. Now, he went off in the typical Trump tangents about, Elon Musk and about golf and a whole range of various different things. But it was a much more centrist, position with Trump elements and flavours to it. And of course, it looks like, they're always going to win the Republicans the Senate, but it looks like they've held on to the House. And that gives them control of all arms of the US government, including a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. But it's a fragile coalition. The Republican Party is not all MAGA. The Senate Republicans are much more Reagan-type Republicans and mainstream Republicans. And if they're holding on to the House by 1 or 2 seats, a couple of things I think will happen. They'll want to push the agenda through, But some of the more extremes of the Republican Party will use that to get their voice. And we'll see a lot of internal debate and a lot of internal discussion. And the question will be, how much can they form a coherent coalition to push the president's agenda through? Because ultimately, House members want to protect their House majority, and the senators want to ensure they protect and defend their Senate majority as well. And their agenda is not necessarily the same as the president's. And it's one of the beauties and complications of the US system. But even with the Republicans controlling everything, don't expect this to be a smooth ride, even on Senate confirmations of some of the key names he might want to put up.
Can I ask about Kamala Harris? She may well feel that, given all that's happened, she might not have had a fair crack at it. 107 days to convince the country to vote for her. Is this the end for her? Does this result disqualify her from having another go in 4 years?
I don't know, but I think it's going to be really hard to come back from here. I mean, this is a decisive loss. Trump taking, the popular vote for the first time since, the early 2000s for a Republican candidate. The fact that all the swing states went very quickly and by large margins to Trump really puts her into a difficult position. The Constitution means that Trump will move on after 4 years. That will mean every Democrat... Well, constitutional change is very, very hard in the United States, as it is here, as we've seen. So there might be some calls for that, but I'd be very, very surprised at that. But I think Kamala Harris will come up against a large swathe of people in the party who believe they can do a better job than her. Who think they can better position themselves. And of course, when it comes to these types of elections, the primary season is so much tougher because of the very open nature of that race.
I'm not pretending to know the mechanics better. I'm just saying who knows Donald Trump, which is a safe thing to put in there.
Absolutely.
Thank you.